Lila had loved Damien once, deeply, but love, when corrupted, can turn into something monstrous. Their relationship had started like a fairy tale. Long walks under starlit skies, whispered promises of forever, and Damien's unrelenting charm. But fairy tales have a dark side, and Lila's came crashing down when Damien's possessiveness began to surface. The first red flags were small. He'd show up unannounced at her workplace, claiming he was just being protective. He'd scroll through her phone when she wasn't looking. By the time she realized the extent of his control, it was too late. The final straw came on a stormy October night, when a heated argument turned violent. Lila fled, bruised and terrified, determined never to look back. She blocked his number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to rebuild her life. But Damien didn't let go. Weeks turned into months, and he continued to stalk her. His car parked outside her building. Anonymous notes slipped under her door, the unnerving feeling of being watched. Until one night, the stalking stopped. Damien had vanished, and Lila dared to hope that she was finally free. What she didn't know was that Damien hadn't just disappeared. He had died. It wasn't until weeks after the police knocked on her door that she learned the truth. Damien had been in a car crash, speeding recklessly on a deserted road. The officer's words were clinical. He lost control of the vehicle, died on impact. Lila felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. She wasn't heartless, but a part of her thought, maybe now, I can finally breathe. For a while, she did. Her nights were quieter, her days lighter, until they weren't. It started with the dreams. In them, Damien would appear, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak, but his presence was suffocating. Lila would wake up drenched in sweat, his name echoing in her ears. She chalked it up to lingering trauma, a psychological scar that needed time to heal. Then came the whispers. Late at night, as she lay in bed, she'd hear a faint voice calling her name. Lila. The first time, she froze, straining to hear over the hum of her apartment's heater. The sound was faint, like someone speaking from the end of a long tunnel. She convinced herself it was her imagination. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You can't ignore me, Lila. One night, the whispers turned into something far more chilling. Lila had just turned off the lights, her apartment bathed in moonlight. As she pulled the covers over herself, she noticed a shadow move across the room. She froze, her breath hitching. The shadow wasn't hers. I'm still here, a voice hissed. It was unmistakably Damien's. Lila screamed, fumbling for her bedside lamp. The room flooded with light, but there was nothing there. Her heart raced as she searched every corner of her apartment. Doors locked, windows shut. There was no way anyone could have been inside. She tried to convince herself it was just a nightmare, but deep down, she knew better. Over the next few days, the hauntings escalated. Objects moved on their own. A picture frame hurled across the room, the faucet in the bathroom turning on by itself. Her phone playing Damien's favorite song at full volume in the middle of the night. The air in her apartment grew heavy, oppressive, and cold spots lingered in places they shouldn't. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, the screen flickered and went black. Then, words began to appear, typed out as if by an invisible hand. You thought you could escape me? Lila's blood turned to ice. She dropped the phone and ran out of the apartment, her mind racing. She sought refuge at her best friend Mia's house, desperate for comfort. Mia tried to rationalize it, suggesting stress or leftover grief was causing hallucinations. But when Lila showed her the phone, the message was gone. Determined to reclaim her life, Lila sought help. She reached out to a medium, an older woman named Eleanor, who had a reputation for dealing with restless spirits. Eleanor listened intently as Lila recounted her experiences, nodding solemnly. He's attached to you, Eleanor said. His obsession didn't end with his death. If anything, it's grown stronger. Eleanor performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting in an ancient language. For a brief moment, Lila felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But that night, Damien proved he wasn't going anywhere. The air in her apartment turned icy, her breath visible in the dim light. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe. Then, she heard it. Damien's laughter, low and menacing, echoing through the walls. Her lights flickered violently before going out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, she felt something brush against her arm. "Did you really think she could get rid of me?" His voice whispered directly into her ear. Terrified, Lila realized she couldn't fight Damien on her own. She turned to a priest, Father Marcus, who agreed to perform an exorcism in her apartment. The ritual was intense, the air thick with tension as Father Marcus recited prayers and sprinkled holy water around the rooms. Damien's presence didn't go quietly. The walls groaned as if under immense pressure, furniture rattled violently, and a guttural scream filled the air. Lila collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as the noise grew unbearable. Just when it felt like the apartment would tear itself apart, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. Father Marcus helped Lila to her feet, his face pale but resolute. "He's gone," he said. "You're safe now." For the first time in months, Lila felt a glimmer of hope. She returned to her daily routines, her apartment free of Damien's oppressive presence. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, all gone. Life began to feel normal again, until one night, as she was getting ready for bed, her phone buzzed with a notification. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she picked it up. The message was simple: "You can't get rid of me that easily." The lights flickered, and in the mirror, she saw Damien's reflection standing behind her, his hollow eyes gleaming with malice. From that night on, Lila realized Damien wasn't just a ghost. He was a part of her now. Wherever she went, his presence followed, a chilling reminder that some obsessions never die. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Emily stood in front of the mirror, her wedding gown shimmering under the soft glow of the dressing room lights. Her bridesmaids fluttered around her, adjusting her veil, smoothing the fabric, and gushing over how stunning she looked. But as she gazed at her reflection, a strange unease crept into her chest, a shadow of doubt she couldn't quite place. "Cold feet," one of her bridesmaids joked, laughing as she handed Emily a bouquet of white roses. Emily forced a smile. "No, just nervous." The truth was, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The sensation had been growing stronger all week, ever since the wedding invitations went out. It felt like she was being followed, a prickling awareness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She had chalked it up to wedding stress, but now, standing in the quiet of the dressing room, the feeling was almost unbearable. The ceremony began without a hitch. Emily walked down the aisle, her father's arm steady beneath her hand. Her fiancé, Daniel, waited for her at the altar, his eyes shining with love and excitement. For a moment, the unease melted away, replaced by the warmth of his gaze. She told herself everything would be fine. This was her day, their day. But just as the officiant began the vows, the doors at the back of the church creaked open. The sound echoed through the space, loud and jarring against the soft murmurs of the guests. Everyone turned to look, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and fixed on Emily. He was dressed in a disheveled tuxedo, the shirt stained and the tie hanging loosely around his neck. Emily's bouquet slipped from her trembling hands as recognition dawned. It was Jake, her ex-fiancé, the man she had left 2 years ago, the man who had sworn she would regret breaking his heart. "Jake?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the stunned silence of the church. Jake didn't move. He stood there, his gaze locked on hers, his lips curling into a chilling smile. "You thought you could forget me, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You thought you could erase me?" Daniel stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "You need to leave," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. Jake tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "You have no idea what she's done, do you?" he said, addressing Daniel but keeping his eyes on Emily. "She's a liar, a manipulator. She broke me, and now I'm here to return the favor." The guests began murmuring, their whispers a rising tide of confusion and unease. Emily's chest tightened as Jake took a step forward. There was something wrong with him, something unnatural. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if he were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. The temperature in the church plummeted. Frost crept along the edges of the stained glass windows, and the air grew thick with a suffocating chill. Jake's smile widened, and his eyes, once a warm hazel, turned an unnatural, inky black. Emily's breath hitched as the lights flickered. The guests began to panic, some rising from their seats, others clutching one another in fear. Daniel grabbed Emily's arm, trying to pull her behind him, but she was rooted to the spot. "I told you," Jake said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "If I couldn't have you, no one could." With a deafening crack, the chandelier above the altar shattered, sending shards of crystal raining down. Screams filled the air as people ducked for cover. Emily's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Jake began to advance, his feet barely touching the ground. His body seemed to ripple and distort, his form flickering like a glitch in a video. The officiant dropped his prayer book and fled, followed by several of the guests. But Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she managed to choke out. Jake's head snapped to the side, his black eyes narrowing. "You took everything from me," he snarled. "And now, I'll take everything from you." Suddenly, the church doors slammed shut, trapping the remaining guests inside. The candles lining the aisle flickered and extinguished, plunging the space into darkness. The only light came from Jake himself, his form glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly hue. Daniel stepped in front of Emily, his fists clenched. "Stay away from her," he growled. Jake let out a bone-chilling laugh. "You think you can protect her? You don't even know who she really is." With a wave of his hand, Jake sent Daniel flying across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and slumped to the ground, unconscious. Emily's scream tore through the air, but Jake paid no attention. His focus was entirely on her. "You broke me," Jake said, his voice cracking with rage and sorrow. "And now, I'll break you." Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let this happen. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward. "Jake, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't mean to hurt you. But this isn't you." For a brief moment, Jake's expression softened. His eyes flickered, the inky black receding to reveal the hazel she once knew. But just as quickly, the darkness returned, more intense than before. "It's too late for apologies," he hissed. "You're mine, Emily. Forever." Just as Jake reached out for her, the church erupted in a blinding flash of light. Emily shielded her eyes, her ears ringing from the force of the explosion. When she opened them again, Jake was gone. The air was warm once more, the frost on the windows melting away. The guests, dazed and shaken, began to rise, murmuring in confusion. Daniel groaned as he regained consciousness, and Emily rushed to his side. "Are you okay?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. He nodded weakly, pulling her into a tight embrace. What just happened?" Emily looked around the church, her heart still racing. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that Jake was gone for now. But as she helped Daniel to his feet, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper. "This isn't over." It started off as a typical move-in day, the kind where you're excited about a new chapter in life. New apartment, new city, new beginning. But for Jennifer, it quickly became a descent into pure horror, one that would haunt her forever. She had just gone through a painful breakup. After years of being with Tom, she couldn't take it anymore. The constant arguments, the emotional manipulation, and the feeling of being trapped in a relationship that had long since lost its warmth. It was time to move on, and with a sense of finality, she packed her bags and left him behind. The apartment was perfect, or so it seemed. A quiet, two-bedroom unit on the edge of town, nestled in a charming but slightly dilapidated building. The rent was cheap, the place was clean, and the walls had just been freshly painted. It was everything she thought she needed, a sanctuary from the chaos of her past. She was determined to start fresh. At first, everything seemed normal. The first night she spent in the apartment was peaceful, almost soothing. Jennifer unpacked her things and arranged her furniture just the way she liked it. The sounds of the city outside were distant, muffled by the thick walls of the building. For the first time in months, she could finally breathe. But soon, things started to change. It began with the small, almost unnoticeable noises. The sound of footsteps echoing from above when no one lived on the floor above. At first, she thought it was just the building settling. Then, there were the soft, almost imperceptible scratching sounds that seemed to come from the walls at night. She chalked it up to old pipes, or the usual creaks and groans of a building that had seen better days. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like the apartment itself was watching her, its walls alive with secrets. There were moments when she felt a cold shiver on the back of her neck, like someone was standing just behind her. When she turned around, there was no one there. One night, the sound of scratching came again, this time louder. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was nothing. But as she lay in bed, the noise continued, growing more distinct. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like something or someone was trying to claw its way through the plaster. Her pulse quickened. Jennifer pulled the covers over her head, trying to shut out the noise, but it only got louder, closer. Her mind raced. Could it be an animal? A rat? Maybe? But why would it be in the walls? She didn't know what to do. In a panic, she jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, grabbing her flashlight. Her hands trembled as she slowly shined the light on the wall where the noise was coming from. The scratching stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The apartment was silent now, eerily so. But then, she heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft, so quiet, that she almost thought she imagined it. Jennifer. She froze, staring at the blank wall. She was certain she hadn't heard that voice before, but there it was again, like a breath against her ear. This time it was unmistakable. Jennifer, I'm still here. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her limbs frozen with fear. The voice was unmistakable. It sounded like Tom, but that was impossible. She hadn't seen him in weeks, hadn't heard from him since their breakup. There was no way he could be here. Shaking, Jennifer stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She had to leave. She had to get out of this apartment before whatever was made itself known. But as she turned to run, the whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. Jennifer, don't leave me. Her breath hitched in her chest. No, this was madness. Her ex couldn't be here. He couldn't be hiding in the walls. Yet, every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong, something she couldn't explain. The next day, she told herself that she was just imagining things. She hadn't slept well the night before, and stress had taken its toll on her. Maybe the old building was just playing tricks on her mind. She decided to ignore the events of the previous night and continue settling in. But the following night, it happened again. This time, the sound of scratching came from behind the kitchen wall, louder and more frantic. Jennifer's eyes widened as she turned toward the noise, feeling her heart rate spike. It was no longer just a faint sound. It was as if something, or someone, was clawing at the walls, desperate to break free. The whispers returned. They were louder now, clearer, almost urgent. Jennifer, I'm still here. I never left. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. She grabbed her phone and tried calling her friend, Claire. But the call didn't go through. Something was wrong with the reception. Her hands shook as she dropped the phone, her mind racing. She had to get to the bottom of this. Without thinking, she rushed to the wall where the noise seemed to be coming from. She grabbed a chair and used it to reach the baseboard, prying it loose. Her heart hammered in her chest as she peeled the wood away, revealing a small crack in the wall. She hesitated for a moment, the air thick with dread, but curiosity pushed her forward. What could she possibly find? With a deep breath, she forced the crack open. The flashlight beam revealed an eerie, narrow crawl space hidden within the walls. It was barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but there, wedged between the beams, was something unexpected, an old, weathered cardboard box covered in dust and cobwebs. Jennifer's hands shook as she pulled it out, her eyes scanning the contents. What she found inside made her blood run cold. The box was filled with old, faded photographs of her. Photographs of her and Tom, taken during their relationship. But the one at the top was the most disturbing. It was a picture of Jennifer, smiling, standing outside the apartment building. Beneath it Written in a smudged, hurried scrawl were the words, "I never left." A chill ran through her body. She couldn't breathe. Tom had been here in this very apartment. But how? Why? Suddenly, the scratching noise returned, louder than ever, as if something was trying to break through the wall to reach her. Jennifer's pulse pounded in her ears as she backed away, her mind spiraling into panic. The voice came again, this time clearer than ever, right behind her. "Jennifer, you can't leave me. I'm not done with you." She spun around, but there was nothing but the empty apartment. Her heart raced, and her chest tightened as the walls seemed to close in on her. That night, Jennifer didn't sleep. She packed her things in a frantic haze, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispers never stopped, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She couldn't stay another minute in this apartment. It wasn't safe. By morning, she was gone. She left the apartment without a second glance, moving back into her parents' home, too terrified to go back to the place she had hoped would be her fresh start. No one knows what happened to her after that, but the apartment still stands, empty, abandoned. The whispers and scratching noises can still be heard if you listen closely enough, and the faint sound of footsteps echo from behind the walls. Some say it's just the wind, the house settling, but others know the truth. The ex who lived in the walls never left. Lena had always been a romantic, the kind of person who believed in fairy tales and love that transcends time. So, when she moved into the small Victorian-style house on the outskirts of town, she felt like she was starting a new chapter, one filled with possibilities, peace, and new beginnings. The house was charming in its own old-fashioned way. Wooden beams, a creaky staircase, and a fireplace that added character to every room. Perfect for someone like her, looking for a quiet place to call home. At first, everything seemed ideal. Lena loved the solitude, the peaceful surroundings, and the space to work on her writing. She was a freelance writer, spending her days at the small desk by the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze. But as the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the house began to change. It was subtle at first, an odd draft, an occasional flicker of lights. But then the strange occurrences began to escalate. It started with the letters. One day, after returning from a long walk through the nearby woods, Lena found a small stack of old, yellowed paper on the doorstep. It was unusual, but she thought little of it, figuring perhaps the previous owner had left something behind. The handwriting on the paper was elegant, almost too perfect, like something out of a period drama. Curious, Lena unfolded the first letter, the words inside capturing her attention immediately. "My dearest Eleanor, I long for the day when we can be together again. Every hour without you feels like an eternity, but I know that our love will endure, even through the harshest of separations. Soon, my love, soon we will be reunited." The letter was signed by a man named Edward. Lena was puzzled. There was no Eleanor in her family, nor did she know anyone by that name. It seemed like an old, forgotten love letter, one that had slipped through time. But what made it strange was the feeling it gave her. As she read the words, she could almost hear the desperation, the longing that echoed through every syllable. It was as if the writer was speaking directly to her. As the days passed, Lena found more letters, each one written in the same beautiful script. She couldn't help but read them, the words pulling her in deeper each time. The letters spoke of lost love, of separation, and of an unfulfilled promise. Edward's love for Eleanor was so intense, so palpable, that it made Lena uncomfortable. But she couldn't stop reading. Each letter felt more personal than the last, as though they were written for her. One evening, she sat by the fireplace, the dim light of the flames dancing across the paper as she read the latest letter aloud. "My dearest Eleanor, I feel you near me, though you are so far away. Sometimes, I hear your voice in the silence of the night, calling my name. Do you feel it too, my love? Are you waiting for me, just as I am waiting for you? I cannot wait any longer to hold you in my arms." It was then that Lena heard it, the faint sound of her name. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but the house was empty. The voice was so soft, so gentle, that she wondered if she had imagined it. But no, it was real. Lena could feel a cold shiver run down her spine. She quickly dismissed the thought. It was nothing, probably just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the incidents continued. The next morning, Lena found the next letter waiting for her at the door, and with it, something that made her stomach drop, an old photograph of a woman. The woman in the photo was strikingly beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to follow Lena wherever she went. The caption at the bottom of the photo read, "Eleanor, the love of my life." Lena felt her heart race. The woman in the photograph looked so familiar, yet she couldn't place where she had seen her before. It was almost as if the woman had been staring at her, waiting for her to remember something. She turned the photo over, hoping to find some clue to its origin, but there was nothing, just a date written in faded ink, March 19th, 1923. As the days wore on, Lena's obsession with the letters grew. Each one felt more urgent, more desperate, as if Edward was speaking directly to her, trying to get her attention. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, and Lena began to feel watched. The temperature would drop suddenly, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. But when she would get up to check, no one would be there. One evening, Lena could no longer resist. She decided to visit the local library to see if she could uncover more about the house and its history. She pulled out old maps, property records, and archives, but nothing seemed to explain the strange events. There were no records of anyone named Eleanor or Edward ever living in the house. The library assistant mentioned that the house had been abandoned for decades before Lena moved in. But as Lena dug deeper, she uncovered an old, dusty ledger hidden in the back of the library's archives. The name Edward Blackwell was listed as a previous owner of the house, dating back to the early 1900s. Her heart raced as she read further. Edward Blackwell had been a wealthy man who fell deeply in love with a woman named Eleanor. According to the records, they had planned to marry, but Eleanor tragically disappeared without a trace before the wedding. Edward, heartbroken and consumed by grief, never stopped searching for her. His obsession with her love letters never waned, and it was rumored that he wrote to her until his death. But no one knew what became of Eleanor. Some believed she had died, while others thought she had simply vanished, leaving Edward to search for her forever. Lena shuddered as she pieced it all together. The letters she had been reading were real. They were the very letters Edward had written to Eleanor, and somehow they had found their way to her. But why? What was the connection between them? Why had she become the recipient of these haunting love letters? That night, Lena sat in the living room, surrounded by the letters, the photograph, and the eerie silence that had settled over the house. As she reread one of the letters aloud, she could hear it again, the soft whisper of her name. Lena. The room grew colder, and Lena's breath clouded in front of her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, feeling as if she were being drawn into something far deeper than she could understand. She could feel Edward's presence, as if he were right beside her, his longing filling the space between them. She turned to face the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to dance and shift. And that's when she saw it. Eleanor's face, pale and gaunt, emerging from the shadows, her eyes locked onto Lena's. The woman from the photograph. Her lips parted, as though trying to speak, but no sound came. The room seemed to tilt, the air growing thick with a suffocating presence. Lena's heart raced as she reached for the letters, desperate to make sense of it all. But as her fingers brushed the paper, the voice returned, louder this time, as if Edward was right next to her. Lena, it's not over. The temperature plummeted. Lena's skin crawled as the house seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing inward. The ghostly figure of Eleanor moved toward her, her eyes burning with longing and sorrow. It was then Lena realized she wasn't just holding Edward's letters. She had become part of the story. The love that never died had found her,